In your average RPGs, the Rogue is your stealth-focused class that primarily deals burst damage from the shadows. That theme continues to hold true in Diablo 4, but there are also builds out there that don't follow this typical playstyle. In this video, I want to go over 3 builds I think might be interesting to check out in the upcoming beta. As a disclaimer, there are no dedicated Blizzard-endorsed Diablo 4 talent calculators out there, so the talents we see could possibly change. I'll leave a link to the talent calculator and the builds in the description. And finally, for these builds, I will be using a character who is level 50 but with no bonus or renown skill points. This will mean that there is still room for the builds to grow once the game is live. To give a brief overview of the Rogue class mechanics, there are 3 different specializations. The first is combo points, the second is inner sight, and the third is preparation. Inner sight allows you to attack marked targets to fill up your inner sight gauge. When it's full, you gain unlimited energy for 4 seconds. This makes it so that you can spam a lot of your core abilities and just deal insane damage. Preparation is currently unavailable in the preview build of the game, so what this does exactly isn't quite clear. And finally we have combo points, and that's what this video's builds are going to revolve around, and this makes it so that your basic attacks generate combo points, and then your core skill abilities all consume those combo points to deal additional damage and add additional effects. This first build I'm putting together, if I had to give a name to it, is the Assassination Rogue. This build will function as your typical attack from stealth kind of class, your typical rogue playstyle. This build will have high mobility, which is going to be the primary focus of defense for it. Getting into our basic attack, we have Blade Shift. This is going to cause you to stab your target and allow you to move freely through enemies for a few seconds. This can then be enhanced to give you increased move speed, stacking up to 20%. Next we have our core skills, and we're going to be take Twisting Blades. This causes you to stab your blades into a target, dealing damage, and it'll cause them to take increased damage while they're impaled, and then after a short duration, the blade will return to you, dealing damage again to enemies as it passes through them. The more combo points this is used with, the more damage it deals, and it increases your move speed. We then enhance Twisting Blades to have it deal increased damage on the return, and finally when it does return to you, it'll give you cooldown reduction if you take Advanced Twisting Blades. Next in the agility section, we're going to be taking Shadow Step. This is going to cause you to quickly move to a target and stab them from the back, dealing a lot of damage and increasing your move speed for 2 seconds. When enhanced, dealing damage with Shadow Step will increase your critical strike chance against that target. And then finally we take the last upgrade for Shadow Step, and this is going to cause you to reduce the cooldown on Shadow Step by 3 seconds whenever you use it on an enemy you haven't already dealt direct damage to, making this a very good opening option when attacking new packs of enemies. And then we also take some passive talents for Weapon Mastery, and assuming that we're going to be taking daggers as our primary weapons here, meaning that we're going to deal 15% increased damage to healthy targets. This will make it so that your burst damage on an opening on a new target is going to be pretty insane. In the next section we have Subterfuge, and for this we're going to be taking Concealment. This is at base level going to cause you to stealth for 4 seconds, making you unstoppable and increasing your move speed, and also allowing you to move freely through enemies. We then enhance Concealment, causing it to give you 40 energy when you actually activate the skill. But finally, countering Concealment, this enhancement will cause your first skill used out of Concealment to be a guaranteed critical strike. Up until this point, this build has primarily focused on single target. So in the imbuement section, we're going to take Shadow Imbuement. Shadow Imbuement causes your imbued weapons to inject a toxic shadow, I guess, into any enemies that it hits. This is going to cause them to explode for shadow damage, and also any additional direct damage while they're infected will deal shadow damage. Once enhanced, Shadow Imbuement has a lucky hit chance, causing any critical strike on an enemy infected by Shadow Imbuments to explode, dealing extra AoE damage. And for the final enhancement for Shadow Imbuement, we take Blended Shadow Imbuement, which is going to cause the initial explosion to apply vulnerability for 2 seconds, giving you an extra damage window on initial application. We then take a couple passive talents here for Potency to increase your imbuement skill damage. And then we also take a cooldown reduction on our imbuement skills because this is our main form of AoE damage. As for our ultimate skills, we're going to be taking Shadow Clone, which is going to spawn a shadow which mimics our actions, dealing 60% of the damage that we do. We then take both talents, enhancing this, causing us to be unstoppable for 5 seconds after casting Shadow Clone, in addition to increasing the Shadow Clone's damage. And then finally we take Aftermath, which is going to cause any ultimate skill used to restore 50 energy. This should help optimize your damage burst when you're going into your ultimate. For our capstones, I didn't really feel like there was a perfect, clear, distinct choice here. So currently I have momentum, which causes any melee skill to grant a momentum buff whenever you're hitting a crowd controlled enemy, or if you're hitting them from behind. When you're at 3 stacks of momentum, you gain 3 different passive effects. You gain damage reduction, increase energy regeneration, and increase attack speed. The other option I was thinking about is Victimize, and this has a lucky hit chance when you deal direct damage to a vulnerable enemy to have a 30% chance to cause an explosion, dealing an area of effect damage around them. Now currently with this build, there's not a lot of ways to apply vulnerability, but we could adjust a few things. For example, we currently have in our subterfuge, we have concealment, which we could enhance it to apply vulnerability, but also we have our shadow imbuement applying vulnerability. Those are our 2 sources of applying vulnerability here, meaning that we could utilize it. We just have to kind of play around with it some more. And then for our Paragon board option, I would take Ultimatum, which is going to increase your damage dealt whenever you cast your ultimate skill. So by increasing your damage dealt, this assumes that your Shadow Clone would also be dealing increased damage. So essentially, it's a huge burst window when you're playing this build. Moving into our second build, I think this is going to be a pretty fun one. This is a build that I'm calling the Saboteur, and it's where most of our damage is focused into traps and kind of mid-range fighting. For our basic attack, we're going to be taking Puncture, which causes us to throw our blades, dealing a little bit of damage, but every third cast is going to slow, and every critical strike will always slow. We then take Enhanced Puncture, which is going to grant a little bit of energy whenever you're dealing damage to crowd control enemies. But most importantly, we're going to be taking Fundamental Puncture, which now causes Puncture to throw 3 blades in a shotgun type of spread, dealing a little bit less damage per blade, but hitting an enemy with 2 blades will cause vulnerability to be applied to that enemy. For our core skills, I'm going to be taking Flurry. This deals a flurry of slashes and stabs in a cone in front of you, and when you use this with extra combo points, it's going to increase the damage and give you an attack speed buff. We then take Enhanced Flurry, and this causes Flurry, whenever it damages a crowd controlled or vulnerable enemy, to heal you for 1% of your maximum life up to 12% per cast. And then finally, we take Improved Flurry, which is going to cause Flurry, when it hits any vulnerable enemy, it will spread to any enemies hit by the Flurry cast. Moving into our agility skills, we're looking at maybe taking Caltrops, although Dash might be a solid option too. For Caltrops, this is going to drop a little zone on the ground that when enemies walk through, they take a little bit of damage, and they're also slowed. And we then enhance that to make enemies take 3% increased damage from all sources each second they're in Caltrops. And then finally, we take Disciplined Caltrops, which is going to increase your critical strike chance against enemies that are inside of your Caltrops, but this is doubled against vulnerable enemies. With Disciplined Caltrops, you can kind of see the synergy starting to form between using Puncture to apply vulnerability, Flurry to extend or spread the vulnerability, and then finally having Disciplined Caltrops to all those enemies that are vulnerable. It's going to start to increase your damage in an AoE fashion pretty insanely. But we're not done yet. When we get to Subterfuge, we get our Poison Trap. Poison Trap places a trap which, once armed and triggered, will deal a lot of poison damage in an area over 9 seconds. We then take 2 enhancement skills for Poison Trap. Enhanced Poison Trap is going to immobilize enemies that are hit by the activation of Poison Trap. And then we take Subverting Poison Trap, which is going to cause enemies to take increased poison damage while standing in the Poison Trap. We then have a few passives that we're going to take with Exploit, which is going to increase your damage against healthy and injured enemies. And then finally 1 point in Malice, which is going to increase your damage to vulnerable enemies. For our imbuements, we're going to be taking Poison Imbuement. This causes our skills to apply a damage over time effect to enemies hit, enhance this to increase the duration of that poison by 1 second. And then finally, we take Blended Poison Imbuement, which is going to increase the poison damage when it's applied by critical strikes. We then take 3 points in our passive Deadly Venom, which is going to increase our poisoning damage. For our ultimate, we're going to be taking Death Trap, and this is going to place a trap that once it's armed and activated will deal insane damage to enemies in an area. We then take both enhancements for Death Trap. This is just currently bugged Supreme Death Trap and doesn't let me select it. So Prime Death Trap causes enemies to be pulled into Death Trap once it activates. And then finally Supreme Death Trap, whenever it kills an enemy, the cooldown of Death Trap is reset by 10 seconds. That would mean that you just need to kill 4 enemies with Death Trap to have it reactivated again. It's only a 45-second cooldown. And then finally we take a couple passive skills here with Trap Mastery. When Poison Trap or Death Trap activates, you gain 12% increased critical strike chance against vulnerable and crowd controlled enemies. And finally, for our capstone, we take Exposure. This causes direct damage to any enemies afflicted by your trap skills to have a chance to reduce your active trap cooldowns by 25%, and also drops some stun grenades that deal area of effect damage and provide a mini stun. For our Paragon board, I think there are two clear options here. The first is Deadly Ambush, and this causes you to deal increased critical strike damage to targets affected by your trap skills. Again, this build is using a lot of critical strike and a lot of vulnerability to any enemies afflicted by your traps and caltrops. The other option I think is pretty good is Expose, and this causes you to deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. And for our last build, we have the one true range build on this list, and I'm calling it the Sniper build. On paper, this build isn't going to have the greatest AoE damage, but it should have insane single target damage, or at least damage in tight corridors. For our basic skills, we're going to be taking Forceful Arrow. This just fires an arrow, dealing a little bit of damage, but every third cast makes the enemy hit vulnerable for 2 seconds. We then take the next two talents for Forceful Arrow, the first being Enhanced Forceful Arrow, which is going to increase the critical strike chance on the third cast of Forceful Arrow. And finally, we take Fundamental Forceful Arrow, which is going to cause Forceful Arrow to knock back enemies if they are close, and if they collide with an enemy, both of them are knocked down for 1.5 seconds. Moving into our core skills, we have, like I said, Penetrating Shot. This fires an arrow that pierces through all enemies, dealing pretty decent damage. The combo point spent will increase the damage and grant a chance to knock down for 1.5 seconds. In the agility, we're going to be taking caltrops because it's going to cause us to leap backwards and drop a few caltrops, which is going to slow enemies, buying us some space. We then take enhanced caltrops, which is going to cause enemies within the caltrops to take increased damage. And finally, we're taking methodical caltrops, which is going to change the damage type to cold, which chills enemies for 20%, slowing them even further. And in this case, caltrops is meant to just buy us space so that we can deal our range damage and build up for our combo points to spend on Penetrating Shot. We then take a couple passive effects here with Weapon Mastery. We're dumping 3 points into here, which is going to increase our damage with bows and crossbows. And then also we take 1 point in Concussive, which whenever you knock down or knock back an enemy, you're going to gain increased critical strike chance against them for 3 seconds. For Subterfuge, I'm between Concealment and Dark Shroud. When you activate Dark Shroud, it causes you to summon 5 shadows, which give you 8% damage reduction per shadow. Each time you take damage, a shadow is consumed, reducing that damage reduction. We then take Enhanced Dark Shroud, which is going to cause the shadows to have a 10% chance when taking damage to not be consumed. And then finally, there's Countering Dark Shroud, which is while you have at least 2 shadows active, Dark Shroud gives you 10% increased critical strike chance. The thought behind Dark Shroud is that you're going to be fighting from a range, so it's going to be harder for enemies to hit you, which is going to mean that you have this 10% crit chance active longer. But at the same time, with Concealment, you'll be able to reposition from enemies, and then you could also get a burst of energy. So if you did something like this, you could do that. And then you could also take Countering Concealment, which is going to cause your next Penetrating Shot to be a guaranteed critical strike, which could be big damage as well. But moving on, we have a couple passive effects here with Exploit. This is going to increase the damage that you deal to healthy and injured enemies, but we also are going to be taking Malice, which is going to increase your damage to vulnerable targets. Moving into our imbuements, we're going to be taking Shadow Imbuement to help cover our lacking AoE damage. Again, this is going to cause your Shadow Imbued skill to infect enemies, causing them to explode and deal damage on death. We're then going to enhance it so that critical strikes on enemies infected by Shadow Imbuement has a chance to create a mini explosion dealing area of effect shadow damage. And then finally, we're going to be taking the skill where enemies afflicted by your Shadow Imbuement take increased non-physical damage for 8 seconds. Moving into our ultimates, we're going to be taking Rain of Arrows. This skill causes arrows to rain down in 2 waves, dealing massive damage. We then take Prime Rain of Arrows, which is going to cause imbuement skills which affect Rain of Arrows to have 20% increased potency. So this is going to give you some insane burst AoE potential, but again, Rain of Arrows is on a minute cooldown. And finally, we have Supreme Rain of Arrows, which is going to cause Rain of Arrows to knock down enemies for 3 seconds. The thought here is that this is going to be an easy way to apply AoE concussiveness, which is your critical strike increase against knockdown enemies, but you could maybe just drop this to get a second point in concussive, which is again in our agility tree. For our capstone, we're going to be taking Precision. This causes your critical strikes with range skills to grant precision, and you gain 4% increased critical strike damage per stack of precision up to a maximum of 20%. When you reach maximum precision, your next range skill is a guaranteed critical strike that deals 40% increased critical strike damage and then consumes all stacks of precision. This means that if you line everything up, your penetrating shot could have insane critical strike damage. Finally, for our Paragon board, we're going to be taking Completionist, and this causes skills that consume combo points to deal increased damage. So essentially, this is just funneling even more damage into our penetrating shot. But I want to hear what your thoughts on these 3 builds that I've shown so far. From a theory crafter standpoint, how might you improve them? Do any of these builds look like something you might try out in the Diablo 4 beta? I have a few more Diablo 4 class builds coming in the near future, so if that's something you're interested in, consider subscribing to the channel to stay notified. It really does help a small channel like mine. As always, this was Goober Troy saying thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.